The pandemic has brought drastic change for millions of people. Do you know what it's brought for small landlords and many renters in our country? Find out on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show. We're going to be talking today about tenants and landlords. And we all know some of the problems that tenants have had during the pandemic. But how many people know about the problems that small landlords have and have had? Well, we'll talk about tenants and landlords, and we'll talk with two lawyers who are experts in their field. The first is Maeve Elise Brown, who's the executive director of Housing and Economic Rights Advocates. And the agency provides legal representation for tenants and representation for small landlords in Oakland. My next guest is Nazanin Shalehi, who is a housing attorney with Community Legal Services in East Palo Alto. So is it correct, Maeve, that we're far more familiar for the most part with the problems of tenants than we are of small landlords?
I would say that's probably the case. And over my years of being a public interest attorney, especially in the first half of my career, I sat across the table from landlords of many sizes, but a whole lot of housing authorities, some very large landlords, a sprinkling of smaller landlords, but I really wasn't aware of data on who those landlords tend to be, how much rent they charge and whatnot. And so from our more recent work at my current office, I have learned a lot, and I've since done also research to increase my knowledge. All of which is to say, you're right. It's just not a common topic of conversation. I think most people don't know much about small landlords.
Yeah, now I'm going to ask Nazanin, when we think of tenants and landlords, do an agency like yours do you have much sympathy for small landlords, given the problems that tenants have had, as renters have had, especially during the pandemic?
I mean, I think that certainly we can see where their fear and concern comes in when you have a moment like the pandemic and you're talking about someone who's maybe renting a room in their house or something just to make their mortgage payments. I can certainly sympathize or empathize with those individuals who are concerned about, older individuals who've put their life savings into a home. And being suddenly concerned that their tenant is not able to pay rent, and also just not being the target for a lot of the legislation that has come out. I don't think that the processes that we've had in place have targeted small landlords and given them the information that they need in order to access these types of programs in order to make sure that they're staying afloat.
Okay, let me go back to you, Maeve. Nazanin talked about some of the issues facing small landlords. Do you think those are the type of issues that you're focused on when you work with small landlords, those in Oakland?
Well, what I think I heard out of what you said, Nazanin, was just mentioning one category of small landlord, which I think is right on target, about maybe homeowners who are renting a room to folks who and absolutely desperately need the rent money to be able to make their mortgage payment. That's absolutely one category of small landlord that I don't think people think about too much, except it probably exists in a lot of people's families or households. And sometimes they're renting to a family member, but they're not really thinking of themselves as landlords. which is also kind of interesting. Maybe something to explore later, but in addition to that category of small landlord, when I say small landlord, I'm thinking of folks who have primarily of duplex and triplex and quadruplex owners. The definition of small landlords, another definition that I've read, is more like 10 units or less, but still quite small compared to a John Stewart company or just any one of many really, really large property owners. And just to add to that, the circumstances of those folks with duplexes, triplexes, and quadruplexes is the laws that pertain to them are frequently different than they are for folks who have somebody living in their home, at least in terms of just cause protections and rent control laws. And their financial circumstance is one that people don't normally think about when we talk about small landlords.
Sure. So let's talk about some of the issues. We just now touched upon some of the issues of small landlords and tenants. And let's talk about how they have been affected by the pandemic. The problems that you just now talked about, did they exist before the pandemic? Well, for both of you. So Nazanin, let's talk about some of the problems that renters have had before the pandemic and how those problems might have been increased.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, some of the main issues that we were seeing before the pandemic was just like crazy high rents for tenants. And of course, as we went into the pandemic and people lost their jobs, they couldn't keep up with those rents. They could barely keep up with them before. And certainly once they lost their jobs or they had to stay at home to take care of kids who were, doing Zoom school or really whatever it was, that people couldn't keep up with those rents. I think another issue that became relevant during this time was overcrowding, because people couldn't pay rent before the pandemic without having maybe 2 or 3 families to a unit. You suddenly had a moment where you had a ton of people who were living in units that were overcrowded, and now you have a highly a virus that spreads basically through human contact. And so you just saw people in those overcrowded environments getting more exposure to this virus because, one, they're more likely to be essential workers, people who were still going to work during the pandemic, and then whatever they were getting at home at work, they were bringing back home to a unit that had maybe 2 or 3 other families in it. And so you saw a prevalence of COVID in those units. So I do think that these issues probably existed before the pandemic and were certainly exacerbated by the pandemic to a ridiculous level, in my opinion. People not being able to pay months and months of rent and owing tens of thousands of dollars in back rent at this point.
So what has that meant, Maeve, for the small landlords?
Well, so it's really interesting because high rents, of course, are a significant. When you think of the Bay Area, you think of many parts of California, but definitely the Bay Area. You think, oh my God, rents out of control, right? San Francisco that had rent levels and that surpassed Manhattan at some point before, but pre-pandemic. But here's something that's really interesting that I hadn't realized before I educated myself on this topic. And I started to notice it with this small contract we have with the city of Oakland, where we're actually not representing small landlords, but we are providing information to small landlords about the rent adjustment program, the rules that they're supposed to be following, relevant state law, relevant federal law, et cetera. And what I learned was really eye-opening. I found that to a person, they were charging under market, significantly below market rent. That was eye-opening. And I did research to find out more about what was going on, because it ran completely counter to what we were seeing from our clients who were tenants or clients who were homeless trying to access housing, but particularly clients of ours who are tenants, because we work on debt and credit and housing stabilization. So we have clients who are homeless, clients in shared housing, tenants in every form of housing possible, and homeowners who are clients, some of whom who live in duplexes or renting out rooms in their home. So we get this panorama. And what I learned from my research is that most small landlords are charging below market nationally, and that small landlords, in the studies that I have read, defined as owners of 10 units or less, account for 50% of the rental market of our rental market. 50% of the rental units on the market are owned by small landlords, but you never hear about them.
No, that's amazing. You always think about these large apartment owners and the large complexes.
Absolutely. And over my years of the first half of my career, where I did strictly tenant advocacy, strictly tenant advocacy and representation in every aspect of being a tenant, I realized now that I was dealing primarily with the larger landlords. And it's funny that I didn't think about that when I was doing the work, but I was dealing with housing authorities and just large private landlords. And I started my career in Los Angeles. But even when I moved to the Bay Area, it was a lot of larger landlords, although I began to see some of the smaller ones when I was working up here also. But I just didn't really realize that the way they're doing business is different. It doesn't mean they're perfect either, but in terms of the rent amount that they're charging, it's below market for the most part.
That's interesting. Now, Nazanin, the tenants, the renters whom you deal with, do they rent from small landlords or do they rent primarily from larger landlords?
I wouldn't be able to tell you the exact breakdown. I mean, I think a majority of the renters that we see are renting from larger property owners, especially in East Palo Alto. And no, I mean, really across the peninsula. We do see some smaller landlords. And I think oftentimes it is what Maeve is talking about, where those smaller landlords are just not aware of the laws that they're supposed to be complying with. And a lot of times it's as much as having a conversation with them or sending them a letter just saying, hey, you're not doing this. And usually they'll correct whatever behavior or practices that they have that aren't in line with the law. With the larger landlords, I think it can be a little bit more difficult because they tend to be, more sophisticated and seem to think that their positions have more validity because of that, even if they're not necessarily also in accordance with what the law is. So, I mean, I couldn't tell you the exact breakdown of it, but I would say that most of the people that we see are renting from larger landlords.
And those who are renting from smaller landlords, Maeve just now said that the small landlords that she's been dealing with have been charging below market rate rent. And I'm thinking the problems that the renters come to you with is not a problem connected to below market rate rents. Right, Nazanin?
I mean, we sort of see all different types of issues. So everything from issues of really high rents and illegal rent increases to things like habitability and tenant harassment, discrimination against tenants. And so that sort of runs the spectrum of landlords with those issues. But like I said, a lot of times with the smaller landlords, it's easier to just have a discussion with them and say, hey, look, like there's this law, you might not know about it. Let me explain to you that you need to do this in this way. And they will often correct whatever practices that they're engaging in. So, I mean, yeah, we sort of see the spectrum because we're not just dealing with issues related to rent, but also issues related to the conditions of units or the way that tenants are being treated by their landlords.
So are those issues, Maeve, in terms of the small landlords, um, that that you've seen come into play, uh, where they've been charged with harassment, for instance?
Certainly, yeah. We've had complaints from and have advised tenant clients who are dealing with habitability problems, sometimes harassment. Absolutely. And I think Nazanin's point is also really well taken about what it takes to get the smaller landlords to back off. At least in our experience, it's been really similar. Larger landlords are more positional. And I think we see this across the board in our society. The bigger that the player is, then the more they're willing to go ahead and spend major money to fight every single stinking thing, even when they're wrong, because they feel as if they're losing ground and they have the financial wherewithal to go ahead and dig in, sometimes to their detriment. Although we've also had sometimes very reasonable experiences with some entities, but still, more the pattern I think that Nazanin was talking about was what we've also seen. It's been, that also that makes me think about another issue that we've really learned, which is access to information. We the three of us touched on that so far in this conversation. Where are the small landlords getting their education? Where do they turn to for resources? And then there's a larger question behind that, I think, about who becomes a small property owner and why, and what they're told about what it's going to be like. These are systemic issues for us, worthy of more conversation about how we think about it.
Yes, and I'd like to keep that in mind and get back to that. Who becomes a small landlord? What are they told? What do they think it's going to be about? And the way you put it now, there's some surprises in store for them. Yeah, but, and I shouldn't say a but, since we're talking about renters who are renting from those small landlords, let's talk right now, Nazanin, about some of the laws, because Maeve said that people might be more familiar with the laws protecting renters than that they are about the laws concerning small landlords. I think that came up. If not, we can clarify it when we talk about the laws with small landlords. So let's talk about some of the laws with tenants, Nazanin. Or was that something that you said?
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly talk about, the laws concerning tenants. I mean, really, the laws concerning tenants and landlords are the same laws, right? It just depends on what side of the coin you're on. So, when we talk about a just cause for eviction or rent stabilization, that applies to both parties. It's just a matter of, are you the landlord who's making sure that you're not charging more than 2%? Or are you the tenant who is, once you get your rent increase, double checking to make sure that you aren't being charged more than that? So, I mean, in East Palo Alto specifically, there are very strong protections. There's the rent stabilization and just cause for eviction ordinance, as well as the tenant protection ordinance, and the RSO, which is the rent stabilization ordinance, does two things. One, it requires a landlord in East Palo Alto, regardless of what type of unit the tenant lives in, to have a just cause to evict the tenant. And that means they can't just give them a no cause notice and say you need to be out in 30 days, 60 days. They actually need to have a good reason. And there's 14 of those good causes listed in the ordinance that a landlord can invoke in order to evict a tenant. And some of them require a shorter time frame. If you haven't paid rent, you only get 3 days to pay your rent before you can be evicted. Whereas if you're being evicted because the owner of your unit, for instance, wants to move in, you're entitled to a 60-day notice in that instance. The other thing that the RSO, oh, sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, before you go on, let's take that, because you said it depends on whether you're a landlord or whether you're a tenant in terms of how you're affected. So, Maeve, let's take a look at just cause for eviction and how that might affect the small landlords that you deal with.
Well, I like the way that Nazanin put it because it's absolutely true. It's potato, potato. It's your perspective, but the law remains the same. How we use the laws or, may vary, right? Advocates use the laws as best they can for the benefit of their clients, but the law is the law. And I always feel very good about telling small landlords, I feel like it's the benefit to everybody. They need to know what the law is so they can follow it. So I would say, I think that, and I'll apologize now if I've strayed off of your question, but I think where can people get access to information about the law and how easily and what is it going to cost them? When Oakland contracted with us to provide this information service, mostly because they were bringing owner-occupied duplexes and triplexes under the purview of the ordinance for the first time. And I think they knew they'd have a ton of angry people and confused people. I'm not aware of any place else that gives any free information service to small landlords, not in our state. I haven't heard of one nationally. And almost to a person, this is the first time that they've actually really talked to a lawyer to get questions answered about what they're supposed to be doing. So access to information, how easily they can access is part of the puzzle.
So why would a small landlord be opposed to an ordinance or laws that specify just cause for eviction?
Well, most of the small landlords I've talked to are not, but most of the ones I've talked to actually don't realize what the law says. They don't realize what they've heard is some of them have heard that, and they've heard this from industry groups, just cause is bad and I can't get my tenants out ever, and et cetera, which is false. There are multiple, good reasons under the law, just reasons under the law defined that usually cover that broad range of things that just about every landlord would think makes a lot of sense. So I haven't had the experience for the most part of having any property owner who actually knows about what the just cause rules are. After I've had them go read the law and I've explained to them what the law says, they're like, oh, I didn't know that. I can do that. I mean, okay, great.
That they can do that. It seems I would think that they might say that the tenants can do that.
Well, but the thing is, the most just cause, maybe as a starting place, and I want to note that most of the just cause laws that I've read about in state of California all allow in non-pandemic times, right? Allow for eviction for non-payment of rent at some point. Now we have state law that, just as an example of something that's a common issue that comes up. There's state law that requires that proper notice be given and that tenants be given the opportunity to pay the rent. So first, before you move to eviction. But if that doesn't happen, eventually then eviction can happen. That's in just cause ordinances. That's still there. That's part of just cause. That's a no-brainer that as long with other language and in just cause ordinances that I've read that says if repeated serious violations of the lease agreement that remain uncorrected could be good cause for eviction, or extreme violations of the lease agreement. If I take a pickaxe to my walls because I'm having a bad day, or
yes.
Extreme. That's a ridiculous example, but it's something extreme. That's just out of bounds behavior.
Well, we're seeing a lot of extreme behavior these days. So let me go back to Nazanin, because you mentioned there were 14 items in that ordinance, so to speak. But let's talk about another one. Other laws, and then we can compare how they affect the landlords.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the other piece, and this is in the same law in East Palo Alto, which is the rent stabilization ordinance, and Oakland has a similar rent rent control ordinance as well, and there are several other jurisdictions in the Bay Area that have rent control ordinances. But the East Palo Alto rent control ordinance basically just says that the tenant's rent can't be increased more than a certain amount each year. That certain amount is determined by the rent stabilization program in the city of East Palo Alto. It's based on this complicated formula that I wouldn't be able to tell you, but they figured out what's fair. And a landlord can't increase the tenant's rent by that more than that percent in any 12-month period. And also that if the tenant's services or maintenance of their unit is reduced in any way, so if they have a serious habitability issue and they've informed their landlord of that issue and the landlord has not corrected that issue, then the tenant can petition the rent board for a reduction or a rebate on their rent because their use and enjoyment of the unit has been reduced by a certain amount for a certain period of time. Which essentially amounts to a rent increase. So that's what the other piece of the RSO does.
So I'm wondering, is that a good place to stop and do the comparison?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Let's talk about rent control and how it affects, or does it affect, the small landlords? You're dealing primarily in Oakland, right?
Yeah, though I've been getting, once the word is out there, you're doing something in one city, then suddenly the floodgates open and it's like, stop. Not staffed up for this. We don't do evictions. Thank you very much. And we do not have a contract with all of your cities to do this. But because, again, we've been representing homeowners trying to hang on to the family home, and many of them have been renting out a room in the house or an accessory dwelling unit that they may have, then, yeah, we've actually become familiar with laws in many different cities. And the rent control aspect is one. Here's how rent control can affect how small landlords compared to larger ones. Larger landlords are all over the rent control rules. And when it comes time to increase rent in any way possible, generally it's going to happen. And the notices they're going to give are going to be right, because you have to have there's strict compliance under our state law with the giving of proper notices to the tenants. And small landlords have problems in a couple of ways. One is that they're not well versed frequently in what the notice itself should look like. And so sometimes it takes them a few different tries, or they have no idea why their tenant may be winning the right not to pay rent increase at a certain time just because there's an error in the format or form of notice.
So is that after being taken to small claims court?
Or sometimes it's just in the course of advocacy. Let's say it could be Nazanin or her office might reach out to the property owner and say, hey, please stop calling our tenant, this tenant client of ours, every week and asking them when they're going to pay the increased amount of rent. They're just not going to. Your notice is not valid. Might be one example.
You sent it by text message, and that's not proper. A lot of landlords will do that because they're smaller landlords and they operate very informally. So they'll send notices by text message, and that's just not proper notice under state law. And so we might reach out and say, hey, you need to give these tenants proper notice. It's not okay to just send them a text message. That is very informal and it confuses them. So if you want to increase their rent, give them the proper notice, file it with the rent board. So, so that it's solidified and in there, and then they'll start paying the rent increase. So yeah, I mean, it happens. Right. A lot of them don't understand. They're like, it's written, I don't get it.
So I think, Maeve, that's some of the surprises that you were kind of referring to when small landlords become small landlords, is it, in terms of things that they need to do, the proper way to do it, and how what they need to know.
Absolutely, because you can run many other kinds of businesses without having to cross your T's and dot your I's in terms of formatting of notices. You could run other businesses every day of the week without that. You cannot do that as a small landlord. Our strict notice requirements in California are, for the most part, strictly construed in favor of making sure that the tenant gets absolutely accurate notice in a particular form, because the state has such a significant policy concern, and localities, but it's our state that has a real concern in making sure that tenants are protected and get notice. But where the itty bitty landlords, they don't have an attorney on retainer. And you would not believe the prices that I'm getting reported back to me by various callers who are like, I was told I had to pay a $5,000 retainer before I could even walk through the front door. I was told that I would have to pay $10,000 for these are, and I'm hearing it too often, like from the hundreds of people that I personally have spoken to.
So, would this mean that there are lawyers trying to rip off or take advantage of the situation?
Well, in my opinion, yes, because there are good lawyers and bad lawyers, just like there are good doctors, bad doctors, and every other professional out there. You know, you've got to shop around. Of course, it's not everybody, but the stories are too consistent for me to believe, and I'm hearing too many different names of different lawyers for me to believe that this is that this is not true. I believe that it is true, and so it's not as easy for the small property owners to get connected with a lawyer who's affordable, reputable, and willing to actually do the work.
Sure, and I'm sure, and I might be wrong with this, that there are probably more legal agencies set up to assist renters than there are agencies set up to assist small landlords. Is that true?
There is zero free legal services for landlords in the state of California. I don't know about other states, never heard of them in other states, but there's a grand total of zip in the state of California. And so that's made it very striking that the city of Oakland decided to experiment with finding a contractor to at least provide an information space to be able to say to people, oh, wow, okay, first of all, these laws exist. Let's walk you through all of the laws that cover what you've just said. And let me give you some more information about things you've just said that I find troubling, and you better understand what the laws are for X, Y, and Z. I mean, it's huge. The amount of information you need to know to be able to run this business really well is just enormous.
Gee. So, Nazanin, you were talking about having a little empathy for small landlords. So why is there, some people might think that that's an imbalance, that you have agencies to help tenants, renters, but not agencies to help landlords, even small ones. So what does that say? That the perception is that it's the tenants, the renters are the ones who get ripped off by the landlords, and not vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason for that is just that the advocates for small landlords have not prioritized them. So, you know, the bigger actors in those spaces have sort of taken their interests and run off with them, and haven't really pushed for support for their smaller counterparts. So, you know, but, you know, I don't see any issue with trying to set up resources for smaller landlords. I think that would help us on the tenant side of things avoid a lot of issues, because like I said, you know, a lot of times having conversations with these smaller landlords and just telling them that these laws exist and they need to comply with them leads to corrective behavior. And if they had a place where they could go to get that support, then it would take not only work off of my plate, but it would also take stress off of my clients who are experiencing, you know, really stressful situations because their landlords just simply don't know what laws they need to be complying with. So they're getting like these really concerning notices, like I said, via text message at like 10 o'clock at night saying, hey, in a week, you need to start paying $300 more in rent. And all of a sudden they're scrambling to reach out to me and be like, well, what do I do? Oh my God, do I need to leave my unit because I can't pay $300 more? And a lot of times it's like, no, this landlord probably doesn't know that there's even rent control in this city and that they can't be charging you that much, or they don't know that the Tenant Protection Act applies to your unit. And so they can't be charging you that
Wait a
much.
moment, it seems to me that those are the basics. I mean, if you're going to be a landlord, don't you think most people would begin to get information on what they can say to their tenants, what they can charge their tenants, what type of agreements that they need to make with their tenants? So let's go back for a moment, Maeve. You said the type of people who become small landlords. So talk about that. What are the characteristics of the type of people who become small landlords, other than these might be people who seize an opportunity to make some extra money by charging rent?
Absolutely. An enormous number. Well, again, I'm going to go back to HERA's mission, because our mission is unusual. We're not a typical legal services program. We're not a legal aid program. We are a nonprofit law office, but we have a broad economic justice, discrimination mission. And within that, we have focused on consumer debt and credit concerns that destabilize households and make it hard for people to access housing in the first place. And so within that context of what the work that we do, we're looking at asset building for people as well. There's a huge wealth gap for women in America, and there's a racial wealth gap in America. How do we build wealth in our country? And when I talk about wealth, that's with the small W, that's not the Jeff Bezos form of wealth. That's the, maybe I become a tiny condo owner, like where I live now, right? After many, many, many years as a public interest lawyer. So wealth with a small W, enough wealth to be able to put your kids through college, to be able to give sightseeing and to leave some kind of legacy financially for that next generation of the grandkids. We do it by buying property. And so it has been for a very long time in our short history as a country that has been promoted as a safe way of building wealth, whether it's buying your own home or having just that tiny rental. No mega rentals, a tiny rental, or whether it's a single unit or a fourplex or something like that. And so you've got a ton of women and a ton of people of color and a lot of immigrants who are small landlords and are trying to create that sort of wealth with a small W to give to the next generation. And so when they're buying this property, so that's number one, that's their orientation, that's their starting place. Number two, they're not told by real estate brokers or realtors that there are these piles of laws that govern the property. I get calls from realtors, which is part of our contract. They permit us, the city of Oakland permits us to answer the realtor broker questions about rent stabilization, because bless the city, they want these professionals to actually know. I've been pleased that we get those calls. But for the most part, they're selling property having no idea what they're putting people into. I get calls from people who just bought a single family home and they think they can move into it. Easy peasy. Not so much, because if they're in a just cause city, I think it's in East Palo Alto, I think, as well as certainly in Oakland and all the other major just cause protection cities I'm aware of, they'll have to pay relocation benefits, substantial relocation benefits. They'll have to give significant notice. If there are certain, in our city at least, personal characteristics of the renter, they might not actually even be able to do the owner move-in. It's not, and this is all outside of the context of the pandemic protections.
Okay, now let me go to Nazanin. Have you had that to happen in dealing with renters where the home they're in is purchased by someone else who's attempting to move in, who wants to move in? So do
Yeah,
the
I mean, I think that
laws
oh, sorry.
cover homeowners?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you buy a property where a tenant is currently residing, so if you buy a home from somebody else and that person was renting to a tenant, um, then you need to provide that tenant with a just cause note. I mean, especially in East Palo Alto, Mountain View, places with just cause, you would have to give that tenant a 60-day notice with a just cause in order to evict them in order to move into the home after you've purchased it. Your purchasing of the home doesn't necessarily mean that tenant automatically has to move out. So, if you don't know that you're buying a home that has a tenant in it, or you don't know that the law requires you to give a 60-day notice in order to get the tenant out before you can move in, you might find yourself in a difficult situation where you've already maybe sold your last home and are planning to move into this one ASAP, but you have to give your tenant 60 days notice for an owner move-in before they have to move. So, it does cover homeowners in that type of situation where they've just purchased a home, there's a tenant already living in that home, and they need to now evict that tenant in order to move into the home that they just bought.
And do you handle lots of cases like that?
I mean, I think that we've seen a few of those. We're honestly more likely to see fraudulent owner move-ins where it's someone who has a little bit more wealth, potentially with a big W, and they just want to get the tenant out for one reason or another, and so they fraudulently claim that they're going to move in, but in reality they have a mansion in Atherton and there's no way they're moving into a
And what is
two-bedroom
it? They're
900
trying
square foot.
to get it out to raise the rent, to have another tenant move in at a much higher rent?
Yeah, potentially with rent, although, rent for single family homes is not restricted. So they could give the tenant a large rent increase. A lot of times it might be because they want to remodel and then rent at a higher rent. So if they purchased a home that was maybe a little bit older and they want to do a remodel before they rent out, then they might give an owner move-in notice, or sometimes they want to get the tenants out before they sell, right? Because it's
Yes.
like the situation that we were just talking about. If you can get the tenant out before you sell the property, you might get more value for it, or you might get more buyers because those buyers then don't have to wait 60 days after they've purchased to move in. So there's a lot of different motivations, but we most often deal with fraudulent owner move-ins.
Sure.
Or what we suspect to be fraudulent.
We've heard recently about moratoriums being extended and across various states. And so let's look at how those moratoriums are affecting small landlords. Have you seen this as a problem, Maeve? You're on mute.
Sorry, muted myself because there was a little background noise on my end.
We would not have known it.
Yeah, the moratorium, my goodness, what a challenge our elected officials have had across the board to try to come up with policies for the first pandemic that any of them have ever lived through. At our state level, we have small land. To answer your question, we have small landlords we're dealing with who are owed maybe $40,000 in rent.
Oh my gosh!
So picture yourself
not by one tenant, but by several.
By one tenant.
Oh really? Over the course of a year?
Over the course of it's been more than a year now.
I would think.
So you're renting out a 3-bedroom house. The rent's going to be pretty significant, even if it's below market. It's pretty easy to get to the higher dollar amounts. The average for folks who are 14, 15 months worth of rent has been more like about 25,000. But, it depends on obviously what the rent level was, but it's an awful lot of money to be without for a full year. And if you own a 4-plex or a 6-plex, and if it's more than one tenant you're struggling with, then that's a huge burden, because most of the protections with regard to mortgages are not strong for the small landlords for the type of loan that they have. The protections on the mortgage front, which most advocates don't seem to really know, is that those protections are for residential mortgages, not for the type of mortgage that folks have on those types of properties. And so when our state made the policies that they made, I really think that they were thinking about large landlords. And they were also imagining, because there's this kind of weird sort of meme out there, oh, well, let's just take all that money for your mortgage if you're falling behind, and we'll stick it at the end of the mortgage and then all property owners are going to be fine, which is ridiculous.
But it makes sense.
But it doesn't make any sense, because the rules actually just don't work that way. But if you mean, gosh, wouldn't that be a nice thing if it were true? Yes, it would be a glorious thing.
Landlords that you talked about, for the women and the immigrants and those who are trying to build wealth with a small W.
Yeah, sorry, what was your question about them?
No, I was just saying how that would not make sense, how that would be very, very difficult. So what are we seeing in terms of the effect of those moratoriums on these small landlords that you just now described?
Well, we're in danger of seeing a lot of properties that are currently have affordable rent levels actually get sold to investors. And I say that anecdotally, and I don't know what you've heard, Nazanin, but I've certainly talked to quite a number of small landlords who are just overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed. They're literally in tears, like, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know when this is going to end, and I have no idea what to do. And I can't afford to pay a lawyer because I'm not getting enough money, because their margins were so small anyway, that they feel like, well, where am I going to print money to go ahead and hire? Lawyers don't work for free. At least landlord lawyers don't work for free.
And banks aren't renegotiating with them. You don't find banks understanding and tacking it on at the end.
No disrespect to my blessed banking brothers and sisters out there, but banks and understanding, not two words I hear normally put together in one sentence when it comes to collecting money that they're owed. And these are mortgage servicing companies, which we know from the great foreclosure crisis don't have the most fabulous reputation anyway, but they're collectors. They're collections companies. Their job is to collect, they will collect. And if it's not a residential mortgage, and if it's not a federally insured residential mortgage, no less, it has to be federally insured to take advantage of the protections that President Biden was talking about, and some protections that were in existence already for federally insured mortgages. So we're going to see some folks who study, for example, I commend you to Urban Institute, great reports that they've done on small landlords and data that they've gathered. They're also predicting we're going to see a bunch of these small properties sold to investors, because
we're going to be right back where we were with the foreclosure crisis, with more and more homeowners losing their properties.
Well, I think it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to see basically the more affordable rents, because data shows that the small landlords typically charge it below market, and that's what we've seen. We're just going to lose a bunch of affordable rental housing because nobody has that conversation.
Sure.
People just talk about landlords as if they were one uniform block of people, all of the same socioeconomic status, all with the same major cash flow. It's just false. At least half of the landlords out there are stretched and who don't have the money to pay for counsel, and they can't get free counsel, and legal services programs don't want to represent them. And there's some understandable reasons we have conflict. There's such a thing as conflict of interest. For us as lawyers, we can't represent people who are in conflict with each other, or potentially in conflict. So Nazanin's organization would have a conflict of interest in representing, landlords who were of people whose tenants they've already represented. We have the same concern, and also it's messy how this is going to get addressed.
Okay, so let's leave it messy slightly for a moment while I go to Nazanin. So you've just now heard the effect of the moratoriums on the small landlords. You primarily are not dealing with small landlords. You're dealing with the large apartment complex owners, I take it, in East Palo Alto. So let's talk about the effects of the moratoriums while they're helping the tenants, the renters, I assume. Are they, Nazanin?
I mean, I think what we are saying on our side of things is that for now it's crisis averted, but there's an eviction cliff waiting for us at the end of this month. There are so many people, these laws are so complicated that as advocates, we spent months just trying to figure out exactly what we could and couldn't do, trying to parse through them. And so for a tenant to try to figure that out on their own, especially if, for instance, they're a tenant who English is not their first language, they're going to have a lot of difficulty figuring out exactly what they need to do to be protected, because these protections are not automatic, right? So in order to be protected under the state moratorium, you have to do several things. You have to submit a declaration of your COVID impact every time that your landlord asks you for that declaration. And you have to pay 25% of your rent for the past 10 months. And so, there's a lot of people who have maybe done one or the other, but have not done both. There are people who have maybe not done either because they didn't know that they needed to, because all they heard on the news was, oh, there's an eviction moratorium. You can't be evicted for not paying your rent. They haven't gotten the full information. And so, we've certainly, I think, avoided the eviction tsunami or whatever you want to call it so far. But I don't know how much longer that's going to happen, especially with how the state rental assistance program is going. That program, which, in the moment that program was being created, I think our focus was both tenants and also encouraging cities like East Palo Alto or the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors to put in some support for small landlords, because we knew that the large landlords would already have it in place to apply for the state rental assistance program, and they would be the first in line. But the smaller landlords were going to have harder time complying with what was required and learning that process, because the state rental assistance program is also very complicated. It's like a super long application for tenants, a pretty long application for landlords. So, I think that unless those protections are extended at the end of this month, we risk all of the progress that we've made, or everything that we've sort of like protected tenants so far. We risk losing all of that because the money is just not getting to tenants and landlords fast enough in order for tenants to comply with the moratorium requirements.
And it seems
so
if that eviction moratorium is extended, that definitely will hurt the small landlords who are looking to get some money.
I mean, maybe, but also, if it's extended, it means the state rental assistance program is extended. And the state rental assistance program says, that if you're a landlord who cooperates with your tenant in that process, you can get up to 80% of the rent debt that you are owed paid for by the state. So that's a pretty good deal, I think, for small landlords who in reality are not going to be able to recover that money from their tenants. Their tenants haven't had income for the past 14 or 15 months. They don't have the money to pay that. So if they can get access to this program, they'll get a guaranteed 80% of what they're owed. But if these protections are not extended, then, that program is not extended, and nobody gets that. I'm not really sure what's going to happen to the money that's sort of sitting there waiting to be administered to landlords and tenants.
So, Maeve, if landlords can get 80% of the money that's owed to them, shouldn't that help them financially?
Well, but the reality is that they aren't getting that. And the reality is, I think, and Nazanin, correct me if my memory is wrong, but I think there's only been a 30% uptake of the funds in a universe in which people are owed piles of money, inconceivable amounts of money, and only 30% of the total funds available, I think, have been spent so far, not just because it's a 12-page application, but because the property owner needs the cooperation of their tenant in order to go ahead and access the funds. Now, what percentage of the actual failure to access the funds is based on that lack of cooperation? I have no idea. All I know is anecdotally about that some percentage of the people I talk to, I would say most of the small landlords, again, this is the small sampling, right, from Oakland. Most of those property owners have a great relationship with all their tenants, except maybe one. And that tenant may have good reason, perhaps, for hating that landlord's guts. I will never know. Or for not cooperating, or bad reasons. But here's what I'm being told. For some of the small landlords are telling me, look, as soon as this person, I know they lost their job, they stopped talking to me, they won't answer their door, I can't get anything out of them. And I encourage them, let them know there's this grant money. It's good for them. It wipes the slate clean. It's good for you. They're like, well, I can't get anybody to answer. So I think some tenants are so traumatized just by this whole experience, job loss, life uncertainty, they will not talk to the landlord. It feels bad. It's just a reminder of the hell that they've been going through. But there's another layer of stories that I'm hearing from small landlords about, like, wow, I have a tenant who's rolled up in a new car. This is common story. The new car story is actually remarkably common. Or tenant was or no new car, but but they know that they're still earning money from other stuff, from Amazon packages being delivered to the house, et cetera, et cetera. I suppose it could all be going on a credit card, but still, that's some other unknown percentage of people who are just like, well, you're a landlord, screw you. Because we're very positional in our society, and our advocacy doesn't make it any better. We don't have good conversations like what the three of us are having now. And our policy making has not been reflective of having good conversations like what we're having now that take into consideration the real nuance of who's experiencing what. So for the itty bitty landlords, for the small landlords, honestly, if this gets pushed back again, for some of them, it's just going to be kind of the last straw. It's already been pushed because it's like waiting to get to the next rest stop, basically. It's like it's been pushed back 3 times the date of release. So I'm also concerned. I'm concerned on both fronts, because we have some tenants who are still in trouble. But I'm so sorry for talking so much, but I also want to note there's been a huge exodus of tenants. And I know from Oakland, massive, at least 20,000 units vacant in Oakland as of maybe 3 months ago.
Okay, so Nazanin just now talked about the impending mass eviction cliff. And here we hear about the suffering landlords. So what can we do? Society is opening up now. Where is the resolution? What can be done to help both sides? And we have like 1 minute.
Well, Nazanin.
Let's go to Nazanin.
Yeah,
Keep
please.
that point. Nazanin, what can we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just need to, like Maeve said, provide information and support for both sides. I think there are a lot of tenants who are very scared. That is probably one of the reasons we've seen a mass exodus, is because for months tenants didn't know what was going to happen, and so they were scared. They thought they had this rent debt and they wanted to outrun it, because they didn't know that any relief was coming. They didn't know that until January of this year, and that the program didn't start until March, which was 2 years ago. So that's a year of not knowing that anyone was going to pay anything or help them out in any way. And you have people who, are now being required to fill out a 36-page application in order to get that relief. People who are undocumented and are worried, that maybe this will result in them, facing consequences that they didn't anticipate or whatever it is. But, I think it's about providing resources and support to both sides and getting the right information to everybody so that people can utilize these programs that are in place. I don't think that the resolution is to end the moratorium because, like I said, I don't think landlords are going to be able to recover this money from their tenants. The best way is to try to get it from the state rental assistance program. The money has been allocated there and it's there to be used. I'm not sure that punishing tenants by evicting them is going to get landlords the money that they need or the revenue that they need, because I'm not sure that they're going to be able to fill their units very quickly either after getting out tenants who are who have been evicted. So that's my my position, and there might be other solutions that I'm not thinking about right now, but that's sort of what I see right in front of me.
Yours, Maeve.
Well, yeah, as Nazanin has already pointed out, the rental assistance program is broken. It's not something that folks can navigate. And the small landlords can't navigate it either. And the burden of them having to provide proof of the tenant's income when a tenant is not talking to them is absolutely insurmountable. It's going to stay that way unless there's a significant rule change. And the whole point, to me at least, I would love to see the eviction moratorium lifted for small landlords only, because they're the ones who are taking it on the chin and need to be able to resume getting income. The eviction is not about punishing anybody. It's about being able to have back the unit to rent to one of the many other people out there who does actually have an income and needs a home, needs some place to live. And someplace that's going to be affordable too. So that's more of my splitting the baby, but splitting the difference there, because the small landlords are in a very particular position and they are a source of affordable housing in our state. And they can't hang on to their property if they don't have income coming in.
Oh, well, it is not a pretty picture, and we look for silver linings, and it doesn't seem right now that there is a silver lining, but just a continuation of the pain from the pandemic that's going to have to work its way out. That's not a good way to leave, but it seems like that just might be where we are right now. And I'd certainly like to thank the two of you, Nazanin and Maeve, for joining me to put so well the situation that's affecting tenants, renters, and small landlords. So thank you so much. Your comments and your sharing and your information is so very much appreciated.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Oh, of course. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.